The smell of cinnamon and pine filled our Cedar Rapids home as I walked through the front door, my heart practically bursting with excitement. Snow crunched under my boots, and I could hear the familiar sounds of Christmas Eve dinner preparation coming from the kitchen. This was it, the moment I'd been dreaming about for months. After years of struggling, of being overlooked, of feeling like I was never quite good enough, I finally had something incredible to share. The email confirmation was still fresh in my mind. "Congratulations, Lauren. We're thrilled to offer you the position of Senior Marketing Director at Morrison & Associates. Your start date is January 8th. I'd read it at least 20 times, each time feeling more real, more possible. Mom looked up from the stove with that warm smile that had comforted me through every disappointment, every setback. "Lauren, honey, you look like you're about to explode with good news," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Dad was in his usual spot at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper with that stern expression he'd perfected over the years. At 58, he still commanded attention when he entered a room, still made me feel like that little girl seeking his approval. But today was different. Today, I had something that would finally make him proud. "I have the most amazing news," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "I got the job at Morrison & Associates, the one I've been interviewing for. Senior Marketing Director, can you believe it?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Mom's face lit up immediately, her hands clasping together in that way she did when she was genuinely happy. "Oh, Lauren, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." But Dad's reaction was different. He slowly folded his newspaper, his eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something cold there, something that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Morrison & Associates," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That's quite a prestigious firm." His tone was measured, careful, and it made me nervous in a way I couldn't explain. I'd expected celebration, maybe even a rare smile from him. Instead, I felt like I was standing trial. "Yes, it is," I said, trying to maintain my enthusiasm despite the growing unease in my chest. "They said I beat out over 200 candidates. The salary is incredible, and the benefits package is better than anything I've ever had. I start January 8th. I was rambling now, filling the silence with details, hoping to see some spark of pride in his eyes. But Dad just sat there, studying me with that analytical gaze he used when he was about to deliver one of his reality checks. Those moments when he'd systematically dismantle whatever hope or dream I'd dared to share. I'd experienced it countless times growing up, the way he'd listen patiently to my aspirations, then explain with cold logic why they were unrealistic, impractical, or simply beyond my capabilities. "You know, Lauren," he said finally, leaning back in his chair with that patronizing smile I'd learned to dread, "I have to admire your optimism. It's really quite touching." The words hit me like ice water. There was something in his tone, something that made my excitement begin to crumble around the edges. Mom shot him a warning look, but he continued, seemingly oblivious to the damage he was inflicting. "Morrison & Associates is one of the most competitive firms in the state. They don't typically hire people without extensive experience at that level." His words were carefully chosen, each one designed to chip away at my confidence. I felt my cheeks burning, that familiar shame creeping up my neck like it had so many times before. "But they did hire me," I said, my voice smaller now, defensive. "They called me personally. The hiring manager said I was exactly what they were looking for." Even as I said it, I could hear how desperate I sounded, how much I needed him to believe in me, to validate this one moment of triumph. But Dad just chuckled, a sound that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was the same laugh he'd given me when I'd announced I wanted to study marketing in college, when I'd told him about my first job interview, when I'd shared any dream that seemed too big for his estimation of my abilities. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "You really thought they'd pick you over all those other candidates?" The room went deadly quiet. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to fade away as his words hung in the air between us. I felt something break inside my chest, something that had been holding me together through years of his subtle undermining, his constant reminders of my limitations. "You thought they'd really choose you for a senior position?" he continued, his voice taking on that tone he used when he was explaining something obvious to someone too naive to understand. "Lauren, honey, you have to be realistic about these things. Companies like that, they make promises they don't always keep. They probably just wanted to string you along until they found someone more qualified. Each word was a knife, cutting deeper than the last, destroying the joy I'd carried home like a precious gift. I stood there, frozen, watching my father systematically demolish the best thing that had ever happened to me. The confidence I'd built over months of interviews, the validation I'd felt when they chose me, the hope I'd carried for a better future, all of it crumbling under his casual cruelty. Mom was staring at him in shock, her mouth slightly open, but no words came. And in that moment, standing in our Christmas-decorated kitchen with the smell of holiday dinner filling the air, I realized that some wounds cut so deep they change you forever. This wasn't just disappointment or criticism. This was something darker, something that would haunt me long after the holiday decorations came down and the new year began. The next few days passed in a blur of forced holiday cheer and underlying tension. I went through the motions, opening presents, sharing meals, making small talk with relatives. But Dad's words echoed in my mind like a broken record. "You thought they'd really pick you?" The question had burrowed deep into my consciousness, planting seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each passing hour. I found myself checking my email obsessively, looking for any sign that he might be right, that Morrison and Associates had made some terrible mistake. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race with panic, expecting to see a message rescinding their offer. The joy I'd felt just days before had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety that made it hard to sleep, hard to eat, hard to believe in anything good. Mom tried to talk to me about it, cornering me in the kitchen while Dad was watching football in the living room. "Honey, don't let him get to you," she whispered, her eyes filled with concern and something that looked like guilt. "You know how he is. He's always been protective in his own way." But even she seemed uncertain, her usual confidence shaken by the viciousness of his attack. I wanted to ask her why she'd never stood up to him before, why she'd let him chip away at my self-esteem for years without saying a word. Instead, I just nodded and mumbled something about being fine, about understanding his concerns. The truth was, I wasn't fine at all. I was drowning in self-doubt, questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and my abilities. By December 28th, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to hear from Morrison and Associates, needed some kind of confirmation that this job was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I called their main number, my hands shaking as I dialed. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with Sarah Chen, the hiring manager who'd called me with the good news. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, "but Ms. Chen is out of the office until January 2nd. Can I take a message?" I hung up without leaving one, feeling more anxious than before. Dad's words kept playing in my head, mixing with my own insecurities until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe they were just being polite when they offered me the position. That evening, I found myself sitting in my childhood bedroom, staring at the printed copy of the offer letter I'd brought home to show my parents. The words looked real enough. My name, the position title, the salary figure that had seemed too good to be true. But doubt had a way of making even the most concrete things seem questionable. I thought about all the times Dad had been right before, all the dreams he'd helped me abandon for my own good. When I'd wanted to apply to Northwestern for college, he'd convinced me to stay local, saying I wasn't ready for that level of competition. When I'd considered starting my own consulting business, he'd laid out all the reasons it would fail until I'd given up before even trying. Maybe this was just another example of his protective instincts, his way of preparing me for inevitable disappointment. The worst part was how his doubt had infected my own thoughts. I started remembering every awkward moment from my interviews, every question I'd stumbled over, every time I'd felt out of my depth. During my final interview, when they'd asked about my experience with international marketing campaigns, I'd been honest about my limitations. Had that been a mistake? When they'd discussed the company culture and work-life balance, had I seemed too eager, too desperate? I replayed every conversation, every email exchange, looking for signs that they'd been humoring me, that the offer had been some kind of elaborate mistake. The confidence I'd built over years of hard work and small victories crumbled under the weight of my father's casual cruelty and my own spiraling thoughts. Sleep became elusive, replaced by hours of staring at the ceiling and imagining worst-case scenarios. I pictured walking into Morrison & Associates on January 8th, only to be told there had been a misunderstanding, that the position had been filled by someone more qualified. I imagined the embarrassment of having to call my friends and tell them the job had fallen through, of having to move back in with my parents while I searched for something else. The thought of Dad's knowing look, his gentle, "I told you so," made my stomach churn with dread. He'd never say it outright. He was too sophisticated for that. But I'd see it in his eyes, that mixture of pity and vindication that said he'd been right to doubt me all along. By New Year's Eve, I was a wreck. While everyone else was celebrating and making resolutions, I was consumed by anxiety about my future. I'd stopped talking about the job entirely, couldn't bear to see the concern in Mom's eyes or the skeptical expression Dad wore whenever it was mentioned. When my college friend Emma called to congratulate me and ask about my plans for the new position, I found myself hedging, saying things like, "If it works out," and "We'll see what happens." The excitement in her voice only made me feel worse, reminded me of how confident I'd been just a week ago. How had I let one conversation, one moment of cruelty, destroy something so important to me? But even as I asked myself that question, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dad might be right, that I was setting myself up for the kind of devastating disappointment that would take years to recover from. As midnight approached and fireworks lit up the Cedar Rapids sky, I made a resolution that felt more like surrender than hope. I would go through the motions of starting this job, but I wouldn't get my hopes up. I wouldn't tell anyone else about it until I was absolutely certain it was real. And if it all fell apart, if Dad's predictions came true, at least I'd be prepared for the fall. It wasn't the kind of New Year's resolution most people made, but it felt like the only way to protect what was left of my heart. Standing at my bedroom window, watching the celebration outside, I felt older somehow, more cautious, as if something essential had been damaged beyond repair. The girl who'd walked into that kitchen on Christmas Eve, bursting with joy and possibility, felt like a stranger now. Someone naive and foolish who'd believed in dreams that were too big for someone like me. January 8th arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to seep into my bones as I stood outside the gleaming glass building that housed Morrison & Associates. My hands were shaking, and not just from the temperature. I'd barely slept the night before, my mind racing through every possible scenario of how this day could go wrong. The doubt that had been growing since Christmas had reached a fever pitch, and I found myself questioning whether I should even go inside. What if Dad was right? What if this was all some elaborate misunderstanding? The thought of walking into that lobby and being told there was no position for me, no Lauren Mitchell on their roster, made my stomach churn with anxiety. But I'd come this far, and turning back now would only confirm every terrible thing I'd started to believe about myself. The lobby was exactly as I remembered from my interviews. Marble floors, modern art on the walls, and an atmosphere of success that both intimidated and inspired me. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s, looked up with a professional smile as I approached. "Good morning. I'm Lauren Mitchell," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm supposed to start today as the new senior marketing director." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. She consulted her computer screen, and for a terrifying moment, her brow furrowed slightly. My heart stopped. This was it. The moment Dad's prediction would come true. But then, her face brightened. "Of course, Ms. Chen is expecting you. She'll be right down to get you settled in." Sarah Chen appeared within minutes, looking exactly as I remembered, confident, warm, and genuinely pleased to see me. "Lauren, welcome to Morrison & Associates," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed completely genuine. "We're so excited to have you on board. I hope you're ready to jump right in. We've got some exciting projects waiting for you." Her enthusiasm felt real, but I found myself analyzing every word, every expression, looking for signs of insincerity or obligation. Dad's voice echoed in my head. Companies like that, they make promises they don't always keep. But as Sarah led me through the office, introducing me to colleagues and showing me to my new workspace, everything seemed legitimate. The nameplate on my desk read, "Lauren Mitchell, Senior Marketing Director," in elegant lettering that made my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The first few hours passed in a whirlwind of orientation meetings, paperwork, and introductions. My new colleagues seemed genuinely welcoming, and the projects Sarah outlined were exactly the kind of challenging, creative work I'd dreamed of doing. But even as I smiled and nodded and tried to appear confident, a part of me remained detached, waiting for the other shoe to drop. During lunch, I excused myself to call Mom from the bathroom, needing to hear a familiar voice. "How's it going, honey?" she asked, and I could hear the relief in her voice when I told her everything seemed to be going well. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and for a moment I almost believed her. But then she added, "Your father sends his regards," and the spell was broken. I wondered what he'd really said, what skeptical comment he'd made about my first day. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to relax slightly. The work was challenging but manageable. My supervisor seemed pleased with my initial contributions, and nobody had pulled me aside to tell me there'd been a mistake. Maybe Dad had been wrong. Maybe I really did deserve to be here. I was reviewing a client presentation when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the new job. Hope it works out better than expected. A friend." The message was innocuous enough, but something about it made my skin crawl. Who would text me from an unknown number? And what did "better than expected" mean? I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to decode its meaning, but eventually forced myself to focus on work. It was probably just spam, or maybe someone who'd gotten the wrong number. That evening, I called Emma to tell her about my first day. She was thrilled, asking detailed questions about the office, my colleagues, and the projects I'd be working on. Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time since Christmas, I felt genuinely happy about my situation. "I'm so proud of you, Lauren," she said. "You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve every bit of success that comes your way." We talked for over an hour, and by the time I hung up, I was feeling more like my old self, confident, optimistic, ready to take on the world. Maybe Dad's negativity had been his problem, not mine. Maybe I really could trust my own judgment and abilities. The thought felt revolutionary after years of second-guessing myself based on his opinions. But as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my parents' home number, and my stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. It was Dad. "Lauren, how did your first day go?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. I told him about the warm welcome, the interesting projects, the positive feedback from my supervisor. There was a long pause before he responded. "That's interesting," he said slowly. "I have to admit, I'm surprised they followed through. I really didn't think—" He trailed off, but something in his tone made my blood run cold. "What do you mean you didn't think they'd follow through?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Another pause. "Oh, nothing specific. I just know how these things can go sometimes. Companies make promises they can't keep, especially in this economy." His words felt like poison, seeping into the confidence I'd started to rebuild. Why couldn't he just be happy for me? Why did every conversation with him have to include some element of doubt or discouragement? "Dad, this is a good thing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is exactly what I've been working toward for years. Can't you just be proud of me?" The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Of course I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I just don't want to see you get hurt. You've always been so optimistic about these things. I worry that you don't see the potential pitfalls." And there it was, the subtle implication that my optimism was a flaw, that my ability to hope and dream was somehow naive or dangerous. As I hung up the phone, I felt that familiar weight settling on my chest, the crushing sensation of being diminished by someone who was supposed to love and support me unconditionally. 3 weeks into my new position, I was finally starting to feel like I belonged at Morrison & Associates. The initial anxiety had faded into a manageable background hum, and I was genuinely enjoying the work. My first major project, a rebranding campaign for a local tech startup, had been well received by both the client and my colleagues. Sarah had even mentioned in our weekly one-on-one that the client specifically requested to work with me on future projects. For the first time in years, I felt truly confident in my professional abilities. The imposter syndrome that had plagued me since Christmas was slowly giving way to a sense of competence and belonging. Maybe I really did deserve to be here. Maybe Dad had been wrong about everything. That Friday afternoon, I was wrapping up some final details on a presentation when Sarah knocked on my office door. Her expression was serious, more formal than usual, and my stomach immediately dropped. "Lauren, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to speak with you privately." The walk to her office felt like a death march. This was it, the moment Dad had predicted, the inevitable disappointment he'd tried to prepare me for. I sat across from her desk, my hands clenched in my lap, waiting for the axe to fall. "I need to ask you about something unusual that came to my attention," she began, her voice carefully measured. "Did you know that someone contacted our HR department about your hiring?" My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" I managed to whisper, though I was already starting to understand. Sarah pulled out a file folder and opened it carefully. "About a week before Christmas, we received a phone call from someone claiming to be conducting a reference check on your behalf. The caller identified himself as being from a previous employer and raised some concerns about your work history and reliability." She paused, studying my face. "The thing is, when we followed up with the company he claimed to represent, they had no record of making such a call. It appears someone was impersonating a professional reference to damage your candidacy." The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. Someone had tried to sabotage my job. Someone had actively worked to destroy this opportunity, to make Dad's cruel predictions come true. "Who?" I started, but my voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Who was it? Did they give a name?" Sarah consulted her notes. The caller identified himself as Adam Mitchell from Mitchell Consulting Services. He claimed to have supervised your work on several projects and expressed concerns about your ability to handle senior-level responsibilities. The name hit me like a physical blow. Adam Mitchell. My father. My own father had called my potential employer and tried to sabotage my career. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't breathe. Everything made sense now. His reaction on Christmas Eve, his certainty that the job would fall through, his surprise when I'd actually started working. He hadn't been protecting me from disappointment. He'd been actively trying to create it. "The reason I'm telling you this," Sarah continued, her voice gentle now, "is because we want you to know that this call had absolutely no impact on our decision to hire you. Your qualifications, your interview performance, and your work since you've been here speak for themselves. But we thought you should be aware that someone was attempting to interfere with your career." I nodded numbly, unable to form words. The professional part of my brain was grateful for their transparency, for their decision to hire me despite the interference. But the personal part, the daughter part, was shattered. How could he have done this to me? How could the man who was supposed to love and support me have actively worked to destroy my dreams? I somehow managed to finish the conversation with Sarah, assuring her that I would handle the situation and that it wouldn't happen again. But as soon as I was alone in my office, I broke down completely. Years of subtle undermining, of casual cruelty disguised as concern, suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't the first time he'd sabotaged my opportunities. It was just the first time I'd found out about it. How many jobs had I not gotten because of his interference? How many dreams had died because he'd poisoned them before they could take root? The man I'd spent my entire life trying to please, trying to make proud, had been working against me all along. The realization was so devastating that I felt physically sick. I left work early that day, claiming I wasn't feeling well, which was certainly true. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage and heartbreak. I kept thinking about Christmas Eve, about the way he'd laughed when I'd shared my good news. "You thought they'd really pick you?" he'd said, knowing full well that he'd tried to ensure they wouldn't. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He'd attempted to sabotage my career, and when that failed, he'd tried to destroy my confidence instead. It was psychological warfare disguised as paternal concern, and I'd been too naive, too desperate for his approval, to see it for what it was. The daughter who'd walked into that kitchen 3 weeks ago, bursting with joy and hope, felt like a different person entirely. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, trying to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to call him immediately, to confront him with what I'd learned, to demand an explanation for his betrayal. But another part of me, the part that had been trained by years of his manipulation, whispered that maybe there was some explanation, some justification I wasn't seeing. Maybe he really had been trying to protect me in some twisted way. But even as I tried to rationalize his behavior, I knew the truth. This wasn't protection, it was sabotage. This wasn't love, it was control. And for the first time in my life, I understood that the person I'd been trying so hard to please was the same person who'd been working to ensure I'd never succeed. The realization changed everything. Not just about him, but about myself, about my worth, about what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. I didn't call him that night, or the next day, or even the following week. Instead, I let the knowledge settle inside me like sediment, heavy and transformative. At work, I threw myself into my projects with a fierce determination that surprised even me. Every successful presentation, every positive client feedback, every compliment from a colleague became a small act of defiance against the man who'd tried to steal this from me. I was good at my job, not because he'd allowed it, not because I'd gotten lucky, but because I'd earned it through years of hard work and dedication. The confidence I'd lost on Christmas Eve began to return, but it was different now, harder, more resilient, built on my own achievements rather than his approval. When Sarah mentioned that the client from my first project wanted to expand their contract specifically to work with me again, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with making anyone else happy and everything to do with recognizing my own worth. 3 months later, on a warm spring evening, I finally made the call. Dad answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar tone of casual authority that had once made me feel small. "Lauren, sweetheart, how are things going at that job of yours?" The question that might once have filled me with anxiety now just made me sad. Sad for the relationship we'd never have. Sad for the father he'd chosen not to be. Sad for all the years I'd wasted seeking validation from someone incapable of giving it. "Actually, Dad, I'm calling because I know what you did," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I know you called Morrison and Associates and tried to sabotage my hiring. I know you've probably done it before. And I know that everything you said on Christmas Eve was designed to break me down." The silence that followed was different from his usual pauses. This one was filled with the weight of exposure, of secrets finally brought into the light. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, defensive. "Lauren, I was just trying to protect you from disappointment. You've always been so naive about these things." But I was done being diminished, done accepting his version of love that looked so much like cruelty. "No, Dad," I said firmly. "You were trying to control me. But here's the thing. I'm successful despite you, not because of you. And I'm done letting you have any power over my life." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The profound peace that comes from finally, completely, choosing yourself.